ברוכים הבאים, ברוכות הבאות. אני דיוויד דוניץ ממרכז השל לקיימות. אנו מאוד שמחים לארח היום את דוקטור אגוסטין פרנייר משוויצריה, שישוחח עמנו בנושא החשוב הזה, מדוע נחוצים לנו אימון ואתיקה כדי להתמודד עם משבר האקלים. ההרצאה תהיה באנגלית כמובן, והמשתתפים מאוד מוזמנים להעלות את השאלות שלהם בעברית, אם אתם רוצים, בצ'אט או ב-Q&A או בלייבסטרים. במחצית ההרצאה בערך אנחנו נעצור ונאפשר שאלות ושיח קצר של התייחסות של אוגוסטין, ואחר כך נמשיך את השיחה ויהיה זמן לעוד שאלות. I'll switch back into English now. A couple of months ago, when the folks at the Swiss Embassy contacted us at the Heschel Center, we thought we were going to a meeting to discuss how we promote our projects at the center. I remember coming out of that meeting feeling thrilled that we had met people with a gleam in their eye, with vision. And we made some good friends and partners for the Israel and global climate movement. Edouard and Liv spoke candidly about their wish for the Swiss Embassy to engage in climate diplomacy. And thus a project was born that they were cooking up called Wake Up. And I think it's a very important project. And here we are today. We're delighted to host our guest speaker, Dr. Augustin Fragnière, on a truly timely subject, lessons from the pandemic, why trust and ethics are crucial for dealing with the climate emergency. This is the first in a series of talks and events that we hope will continue and build a good Swiss-Israel connection by exchanging thinking and good practices to build back better to a bold and resilient climate policy that we need in Israel and the world needs. I want to thank everyone who's made this possible, to Liv and Edouard and Moritz from the embassy and to all the Heschel staff, and for the ongoing support of our team, Maureen, Liraz, Ronnie and Tamara, co-directors. And we're happy to have here with us the ambassador of Switzerland to Israel, Mr. Jean-Daniel Ruch. We want to warmly thank you, Ambassador Ruch, for the embassy's effort to make this terrific idea a reality. And I invite you now for some opening remarks.
Thank you so much, David. Likewise, we are truly delighted to be able to partner with you and your colleagues at the Heschel Center for Sustainability for this event. I would really like to express my gratitude to you and to Leah Ettinger and the whole team for making this exchange of today possible. And obviously, also, I would really like to express my gratitude to Augustin Fragnière for sharing with us his inspiring work and his thoughts today. And thanks to all of you who are joining this event with us. The whole world is focused on COVID-19. However, many scientists and healthcare practitioners are telling us that the dangers of climate change far exceed those of the pandemic. To help understand and start address those challenges, the Embassy of Switzerland has launched the project Wake Up, Diplomacy Towards a Healthy Future, which is aimed to become a multi-year program to foster dialogue between Israel and Switzerland on sustainability. We do think that both our countries have a lot in common. We have roughly the same population. We have both very innovative economies and relatively little natural resources. We think we have a lot to learn from each other on how to deal with the environmental crisis. Therefore, we have launched a website, wakeupnow.ch, where you can find many information on this event, on future events also. Sustainability has become a central aspect of policymaking in Switzerland. 21% of Switzerland's national councillors, our members of parliament, come from green parties following our last election of 2019. Despite emitting only 0.1% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions, which is not far from Israel's 0.2%, there is a strong willingness in Switzerland to curb emissions further for the benefit of the next generations. The Swiss people generally are aware of their disproportionate contribution to global warming. The Swiss government has therefore decided to become carbon neutral by 2050. However, a lot of work remains to be done, and many young people, especially the so-called climate strike movement, are already disappointed with the latest CO2 law, which is, in their view, is not ambitious enough to achieve carbon neutrality. What lessons can we draw from the pandemic to foster climate action? How can ethics and trust make a difference in the public debate and ultimately in political decision-making? These are some of the questions that will be addressed in today's talk, and I really look forward to an inspiring conversation. Back to you, David. Thanks to all of you for being here.
Leah, right.
Yes, thank you very much, Ambassador Wu, for your words. It is encouraging that so many people are talking now much more about combating climate change. However, the framing of the issue is very often as a technological challenge, how we can transition quickly to renewable energy, etc. If there is something that the COVID pandemic is teaching us, is that technology and science are not enough. It shows us the vital importance that trust plays. Even if we have an available vaccine, even if we have, which we do have, a science-based hygiene policy, we won't succeed to end the pandemic without the cooperation of a public that trusts the leadership and listens to the science and agrees to get vaccinated. It is therefore, I'm therefore very delighted to have this conversation with Augustin. Augustin offers us a new framing that highlights the important role of ethics and the democratic principles in facing the different dimensions of the crisis that we are facing. Augustin Fragnière is a trained philosopher and environmental scientist who has specialized on climate ethics and sustainability theory. He currently works at the Interdisciplinary Center for Sustainability at the University of Lausanne. Augustin Fragnière is also active in the public debate on climate policy and the ecological transition in Switzerland. So thank you very much for being with us today, Augustin, and the stage is now yours.
Well, hello everybody. Thank you, Leah. It is my turn first to thank the Swiss Embassy and the Heschel Center for this kind invitation, and I really look forward talking with you about all these very important topics. So I'm going to share my screen now and my slides before I start with the talk. Here it is. So we're going to talk today, as David and Leah expressed, of ethics first in the first part, and then democracy or political institutions, at least. So the first thing maybe to observe is that during the first wave of the COVID pandemic, this spring, people have hailed the beneficial effect of the lockdowns on the environment. For example, we've seen spectacular improvement in air and water quality in some parts of the world. You have probably seen those maps from China with the concentration of diverse air pollutants that has decreased dramatically following the lockdowns. We've seen pictures of the canals in Venice with crystal clear water, or people in India able to see the Himalayas for the first time because of air quality. But, and it is a fact, the lockdowns and all the COVID measures have had an impact also on greenhouse gas emissions. And that was indeed pretty impressive. So here, for example, you see the difference in global daily emissions during the first 6 months of 2020. So the pink line here. And so over this period, so from January to July, to the end of June, actually, the pandemic has brought about a decrease of around 9% in global emissions. And at the height of the pandemic in April, so here, the lockdowns caused a decrease of about 20% in global emissions. And here in this different graph, you can show the total so far, because it's not over, of course, the total impact of the COVID situation on global emissions this year. And this is very interesting because this graph represents the annual change of CO2 emissions. And historically, I mean, and you can see that the impact of COVID is much bigger than in the case of previous crises, such as World War II, for example, or the 29, where is it here, the 29 financial crisis. So this makes sense in some way, insofar as we are emitting today much more than we were emitting in the 1940s. So an economic slowdown has also more impact on the emissions in absolute terms. However, despite this impact, so even though reducing greenhouse gas emissions in itself is a good thing, this decrease due to COVID is probably only temporary, at least we hope so, in terms of health issues. Temporary and is in fact pretty small compared to what should be done to address the climate crisis. So if we want to reach the goals of the Paris Agreement, we should reach zero net emissions around 2050. And this means cutting emissions, global emissions by 8% each year, and not only once. Furthermore, these cuts due to the COVID situation have been achieved involuntarily and at great economic and social costs, which we want to avoid, of course, in the case of climate change. So there are important differences between the COVID emergency and the climate emergency, implying that we cannot just transpose the solutions to COVID to the case of climate change without any reflection. And I'll say a little bit more about that later. But despite these differences, there are still analogies between those two problems, and from which we can draw lessons. And that's on those analogies that I would like to focus first. So one first common issue, or common feature, I would say, between the COVID and climate change is that both are fundamentally moral issues. They are basically ethical questions. We are not used to think in moral terms anymore today, but if we think of it, the need to protect the most vulnerable is the keyword of most countries' response to the COVID-19 pandemic. This moral imperative, protect the vulnerable, is a virtually universal ethical principle found in most human societies. In democratic countries, in particular, it is strongly associated with the enjoyment by each individual of fundamental rights, including the right to life, the right to health, the right to subsistence, and so on. And the enjoyment of these rights is considered independent, and that's an important point, so I'd like to emphasize it. It's independent on the person's identity and particular circumstances of life. These rights are granted to people solely by virtue of the fact that they are human beings, and that's why we call them human rights. And fundamental rights generate moral duties for the others. Those duties can be negative, like the duty not to harm others and to respect their fundamental rights. So duty is not to conduct actions that threaten the enjoyment of their rights, but also sometimes positive duties, that is, duties to help people when they have issues with their fundamental rights, even if we are not the cause of those problems. So the fundamental interests of the most vulnerable, in other words, those who are likely to suffer the most from the consequences of a given situation, must be protected, even, and that's also important, even at some proportionate cost to the rest of society. And that's what I think we witnessed during the first wave of the COVID, and maybe now during the second wave as well. It is that short-term economic interests were put on hold for some time in the name of public health. So such an attitude of respect and solidarity for life and for the individuals does not, however, stop at managing pandemics, of course. It is a fundamental principle on which all the activities of our society should be organized. It's an organizing principle and moral principle of our societies. So my point here is that this same moral imperative, protect the vulnerable, also applies, and with equal force and urgency, to contemporary environmental problems such as climate change. So of course, the vulnerable are not exactly the same in the COVID situation and in the climate change situation. In the case of COVID, it is mostly elderly and people with preconditions that are vulnerable. In the case of climate change, it is first and foremost the least well-off of the planet. That is the poorest countries or poor people in developed countries. It is also future generations, because even though the consequences of climate change are already unfolding now in some parts of the world, future generation will have to suffer the lion's share of the consequences of climate change. So the poor people, people in developing countries, and future generations are the vulnerable. And by the way, these people are also those who have contributed the least to the causes of climate change. So there is a huge problem of justice here, because there is a huge asymmetry between who caused the problem and who will have to suffer the consequences. So these people are not, or not always, for now at least, our co-nationals or our contemporaries. But that doesn't change anything to our duty to protect them from the threat of a warming world. The right to life is not weaker or less important for them than the right to life of our contemporaries. As I said before, the fundamental rights are independent of a person's identity or location in space and time. Indeed, making rights dependent on somebody's circumstances and identity would be morally kind of arbitrary. It wouldn't be a fundamental right then, it would be a special right. So our moral duty to protect the vulnerable also applies to foreign nationals or future generations. At least, I mean, this is the argument, and this is how human rights universalism works. So we might wonder, since we have this same moral duty that we applied pretty well with more or less success in the case of the COVID situation, taking drastic political and economic decisions in the name of this imperative, why don't we apply it with equal force to our response to the even more threatening climate emergency? So to understand that, I think that we need to have a closer look at the important differences between the current pandemic and climate change. So there are differences in the very basic characteristics of the two crises, of these two problems, and in the way they influence the way we perceive them. So if we take the dimension of time, the time dimension, for example, it is clear that COVID is a rapidly spreading disease. It's very fast, whereas climate change is slow, progressive, and intergenerational. And indeed, to be very accurate, climate change, we should not frame it as a crisis, because there won't be a huge problem and then back to the normal. Climate change will be a new normal. It will change things forever. There is some kind of irreversibility involved in climate change, and that makes also a huge difference. In space, there are also differences. COVID is threatening us and our beloved ones directly, whereas climate change appears, at least for most people, like a more distant threat. People are not, at least in developed countries, those who contribute the most to the causes of climate change, people are not suffering every day from climate change. So it's hard to imagine that as a very proximate threat. The causal pathway for those two crises is different as well. COVID is a very simple and straightforward, even though it's complex, disease. We know more or less how people contaminate each other and how the disease spreads, even though we have some uncertainties left, but we know the mechanism. In climate change, we know how it works as well, but it's pretty indirect and complex phenomenon. Most of all, what's important and relevant here is that climate change is caused by a multiplicity of causes. It is the accumulation of a huge number of tiny contributions, CO2 emissions, that altogether accumulate in the atmosphere and create the problems. And the causal pathway is pretty indirect as well. So CO2 emissions have the effect of raising global temperature. The global temperature causes extreme weather events. And these weather events, for example, cause harm to a lot of people. So it's pretty indirect. And when it comes to our emotional self, there are also differences in the way we perceive those two emergencies. COVID appeals directly to our instinctive fears, whereas climate change, since it seems more distant, appeals, or should appeal at least, to our sense of morality. So it's more abstract in some kind. So psychologists use this notion of psychological distance to explain why we experience difficulty to act upon climate change. So the more distant, psychologically speaking, and those different parameters explain psychological distance. So the more distant a problem is, the less motivation we have to tackle it. Some philosophers propose similar explanations. For instance, the American philosopher Dale Jamieson said once that our value system is not adapted to guide our reflections and actions about complex global phenomena and global problems like climate change. So that was in 1992. So it's been here for a while, this reflection. And according to him, this is because our value system evolved over many centuries in a very different social and technological context. Our value system evolved in low density population areas with, where most human interactions were close in space and time, where we had less technological power. So he says, no, our sense of responsibility in particular is not adapted to this situation. So he had this famous quote that has become very famous now. He said once, we face today the possibility that the global environment will be destroyed, and yet no one will be responsible. So that's pretty striking. It shows well that we have to think and change, if possible, our moral conceptions of responsibility and duties when we're confronted to such a complex problem. So responsibility, what it means exactly, so it has two meanings. Responsibility can be understood in a backward-looking sense, in the sense of I'm responsible for what happened because I caused it. And it could be understood in a forward-looking sense, in the sense I'm responsible to see to it that we do something about this situation. I'm in charge of doing something. So Jamieson, when he wrote about that, had a backward-looking sense in mind, but I think it's equally valid for the forward-looking sense, because climate change is such a complex and seemingly distant problem, and with a fragmentation of agency, as we say in the jargon, the fact that my own contribution is very tiny, and if I change my behavior, the effects of that will be small as well. Nobody feels really in charge of that, in charge of doing something about it. Or it's harder, at least. So we don't act because we don't feel really responsible for this problem. So the very characteristics of climate change are obstacles to ethical action. But there are also differences with COVID regarding the solutions to fight the problem. So here you have just 3 propositions. So international cooperation, for example, it's very useful in the case of a pandemic. Of course, we have to coordinate the response again between different countries and so on, but it's not indispensable. At least in theory, a country could close its borders and take drastic measures inside to protect its population from a virus. It's not possible at all in the case of climate change. International cooperation is absolutely indispensable if you want to solve this problem, because if only a few countries act, climate change will carry on forever. When it comes to the economy, lockdowns have proved pretty efficient against the COVID pandemic, but that means a complete stalling of the economy, and that has a pretty huge cost to people. We don't need to do that in the case of climate change. What we need here is a long-term and profound transformation of our economy and of our society. We don't need to stop the economy. We need to transform it rapidly, but progressively over the long term. So in one sense, that's a good news because it's less brutal and it's less costly. In another sense, it's also pretty challenging to put into practice. And when it comes to technology, the third line here, well, it's true, as Laia said in introduction, that technology is not enough, but at least we have the hope to find a vaccine someday, or at least an efficient treatment against COVID. But we have no vaccine against climate change. We have no silver bullet technology, meaning that yes, technology, innovation are important and part of the solution. We have to switch from fossil fuel to renewable energies, but that will not be enough without restructuring and implementing more profound social and economic changes in the model. So now, all these elements can explain why most countries on the planet are struggling to act upon climate change. So, but I'd like to be clear about the fact that these features, yes, are obstacles to ethical action, and they can indeed explain why we don't act to protect the vulnerable from climate change, but they constitute by no means an excuse for inaction. So if there's one thing that the COVID crisis should encourage us to do, is to make an effort of what I call moral lucidity. That is to try to see the major moral imperative of preventing a climate catastrophe. Just as we have done more or less successfully with the pandemic, we must listen to science and anticipate the problems with their specific temporality. So of course, in the case of COVID, it's a matter of days or weeks. In the case of climate change, it's a matter of years or decades, but the logic remains the same. We have to anticipate before the real problems are upon us. In the case of the COVID, once the cases are skyrocketing, it's probably too late to have effective measures, even though you can lock down everybody and it seems to work, but still. In the case of climate change, once the consequences begin to unfold, it's too late, we can go back. So it's especially important to anticipate in the case of climate change, because there will be no opportunity to learn from our mistakes and do better next time. There won't be a return to normal. So that's why we should, I think, learn lessons from this COVID situation, apply them to other problems such as environmental problems. Oh, sorry, that was for not for now. So, so far I have pointed out that COVID and climate change were both fundamentally moral problems, but there's another common feature that I would like to emphasize is that both problems are collective action problems. They require coordinating the behavior of a large number of people, because if a large portion of the population doesn't play by the rules, in the case of COVID, social distancing, mask wearing, and so on. In the case of climate change, refraining from engaging in greenhouse gas emission activities, this puts, so if a large portion of the population doesn't do that, this puts the whole endeavor in jeopardy. And this is exactly what happened, I think, in the case of COVID, at least in Western Europe. People were not able to keep social distancing themselves, etc., etc. So the governments didn't hesitate to put regulation and incentives in place to counter this problem of non-compliance. The problem is non-compliance here. So in the case of climate change, on the contrary, information campaigns have traditionally largely focused on spontaneous behavior change. So that is ride your bike, change your light bulbs, buy local, etc. But I think that we, the climate community, have neglected the collective and political side of the issue for a long time. It's beginning to change now since 2019 with the huge demonstrations and the climate strike movement in particular, it's beginning to change. But I think that we should emphasize much more the systemic dimension of the problem and not only its individual dimension. Yes, because greenhouse gases emissions follow an identifiable pattern linked to a consumption-driven economic system, and individuals are caught in this system and incentivized to consume as much as possible. Think here of advertisement campaigns trying to incentivize you to buy a new car every 5 years, for example, or planned obsolescence strategies. So the fact that your vacuum cleaner breaks down after 2 years, for example, or that your iPhone is already old-fashioned after 2 or 3 years, and you feel the urge to buy a new one. Those are all marketing and economic strategies, and we could fight against that also. We would have the technical knowledge to build very sustainable objects, but we don't do because of basically the economic system and that is based on consumption and the marketing strategies of companies. So it is hard for individuals to dramatically change their consumption habits in this context. We can be pretty sure, I am pretty sure, that climate change won't be solved with appeals to individual responsibility and responsible consumption alone. Of course, it's important, but it's just part of the solution. There will always be, if we just focus on that, too much non-compliance. So one reason for that, well, I've talked about that already, is that we have conceptual and psychological barriers to ethical action. But another reason is that a large part of greenhouse gas emissions are not under the control of individuals. Here you see the results of a study conducted in France not so long ago. And it shows that even with what they call here ambitious voluntary commitments from individuals, so in the French version, they call that heroic changes of behavior from the part of individuals. So even if we postulate, we make the hypothesis that people will engage in ambitious behavior changes, individuals can only be expected to reduce their emissions by 45%. So here, if we want to go from here to here, that their hypothesis is that to be aligned with the Paris Agreement target, France would have, or people would have to cut their emissions by 80%. So if you, for example, eat, you adopt a vegetarian diet, you fly less. So actually that might be a translation issue, because in the French version, it's no flights anymore. You use car sharing or bicycle for the small distances and so on. You consume locally. You can cut about 25% of your individual carbon footprint. If you invest in your house and in your vehicle, it's 20% less. So that's the part of the leeway of the individuals. All the rest is emissions from the industry, from agriculture, from freight, public services, heat, gas, electricity. Those are systemic emissions that require also public investments and regulations. So not everything is under the control of individuals. Of course, we could stop consuming altogether, but that's pretty hard in the current context. There are also other reasons to see climate change as a systemic problem and to insist on the fact that we need a political answer to it. Is that changing together and not just a part of the population is much more effective? As I said, actually, it's the only way to solve climate change. But it is also less costly. It's more efficient because it's less costly. It's less costly economically, because if you produce a certain type of goods, sustainable goods, for example, on a very large scale, well, the prices go down and it's more affordable, but it's less costly psychologically because it's easier to change your way of life if all your neighbors and friends and family are changing at the same time around you. You don't see people enjoying the luxuries of profligate lifestyle when you have to restrict yourself. But it is also fairer and fairer to those who are really trying to do something. There is no reason that only a very motivated minority should bear the whole burden of trying to deal with climate change. And in fact, I would add to that, that in history, environmental history, we see that virtually no complex environmental problems have ever been solved without state regulation, without a political response to the problem. So since it is a systemic and political problem, climate change is an issue that we should be worried about as much in our capacity of citizens as in our role of consumers. Well, it is at least as important, I think, to help bring about a real political response to climate change than to reduce our own carbon footprint. And this brings us to the question of democracy, but I think I should pause for a little while here and see if you have questions, and maybe we could engage in some dialogue before we jump to the second part of the event.
There are some, thank you very much, Augustin. There are some very good questions coming up. I took away, there is no vaccine from climate change, for climate change. I like that a lot. We with that one. But a few of the questions that are coming up, one is, I'll share one that I have from your talk, is like you showed in the graph, we're going to have to do sort of a COVID crisis every year for the next 25 years to be able to reduce, if we go according to what that graph shows, or something like that. In other words,
yes,
it seems like it could also be used in the anti-climate movement, because they could say, look, is this what you want? Is this what you want? We'll have no more fun. We have no more consumption. We have no more all the good things that people like, flying and doing. So my question is really at the base of it is it possible to meet climate change and still lead good and happy lives and moral lives, of course, but also we have to give people some sort of sense of a vision of a better life as well. And there's a lot of restrictions involved, the way it seems in what's being indicated.
Yeah. So thanks, that's a great question. So indeed, in terms of emission cuts, what we should do would be the equivalent of the COVID crisis every year. But I also pointed out the fact that the solutions are not the same. And it's true that put that way, it would be a double-edged sword, because people could say, no, we don't want that every year. So we had to emphasize the fact that no, the solutions are different. We have to transform our economy progressively. So we have, unfortunately, if we had begun to address the crisis 20 years ago, it could have been pretty slow and progressive. And now we are running out of time. So we have to put up very ambitious measures, but still, it's not exactly the same as just blocking everybody at home and stalling the economy and so on. So I think it's not the same. We should not conflate the crisis totally. And that's why I said at the outset of my talk, there are analogies, but there are also differences. And that's one of the differences, I think. Now, the second part of your question, is it possible to live decent and happy lives while at the same time trying to tackle climate change? And I'm pretty sure that yes, we can. But as I said, we have to take pretty ambitious measures on the economic front, and that means transforming not only our energy system, but also the way our economies work, probably, the way we move, we travel, we relate to people. So yes, that involves some restrictions, but I'm pretty sure that it's possible to live a happy life without going to Barcelona each weekend on an EasyJet flight. So no, I'm quite optimistic about that, but this means that we have to realize the full measure of the problem we have and try to really find meaningful solutions to it before it's really too late.
I think that feeds into what you're saying about, or you quoted Jameson of saying that we need to really reconfigure our value system, and what we cherish, in fact, in life, and our deepest values are just as important as any technical fixes that we can make right here. And I want to feed you in a few of the other questions that are coming your way. I'll read you a couple, and you can answer them as you like.
Okay.
There's one question that came up about how you approach the ethical question of human population growth and the Malthusian catastrophe. That's from Zeb Zimmerman. And Michal Sarfati asked, is there a connection? Do you see any connection? Maybe this is a conflation you talked about that isn't useful, but you say what you think, between the outbreak of COVID-19 to climate change. In other words, we're not facing climate change. Do you think COVID-19 would have happened?
Okay, very interesting. So I'm going to just say a quick word about the second question and then carry on with the first one. So connection between COVID and climate change, to my knowledge, there is no direct connection between climate change and this health crisis and pandemic, but there is clearly a connection between biodiversity loss and habitat loss and the appearance of new pandemics and new viruses within the human domain. So I would say that the analogy goes this way. The destruction of wild habitat, wild species, and the erosion of biodiversity is a threat multiplier, and it multiplies the chances that new diseases emerge from the animal, the animal kingdom and passes to the human domain. Equally, climate change is also a threat multiplier in the same vein as biodiversity loss and habitat destruction. But the risks are not exactly the same. So there are also, for sure, health risks implied by climate change, like all that has to do with heat waves, with vector-borne diseases like the malaria-spreading mosquitoes are going further and further, for example. So there are also health risks with climate change, but different ones, just not forcibly new viruses or bacteria. But still, so there is not a direct link between climate change and COVID, but the underlying logic of environmental degeneration and destruction as a threat multiplier remains true and remains the same.
And perhaps the same economic logic of consumption and unbridled consumption actually work in both spheres.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Here's an interesting question from Meir Hansen from the Heschel Center. And she asks, can the issue of moral responsibility be disconnected from one's power and authority to make change? Does appealing to individual responsibility help when there are structural problems? And that might tie into question of Danielle Baron, who asks, what do you think is the best act an individual can do to treat climate change? Okay, what can men do to influence the system?
Yeah.
So there are questions, I think, of agency and
okay.
what is the link really between the collective and the individual responsibility? I'll add one more thing in here. Dotan from the Green Network, I think it's that Dotan asks, what do you mean by working together, by changing together? What does that actually mean?
Mm-hmm.
Changing all together, you said.
Yeah. Okay. First of all, there was a question about population. Shall I quickly respond to that, or do we switch to another topic? What do you think, David?
That's a different issue.
Yeah,
not really different, but it's a big one.
Yeah. Do we have? Okay, so
I don't know if we have that much time to really.
Okay, so we'll see at the end if we have more time to come back to that important issue. But okay, when it comes to moral responsibility, of course, I think that insofar we have what I call climate duties, that is duties to try and do our best efforts to address this problem. It can materialize in different ways. So one way is to pay attention to our own carbon emissions, as I said, and the other way is to act as a citizen. And here, what can we do? We can vote first for people who care about the climate crisis and want to do something about it. We can participate to demonstrations. We can write opinion articles in journals or blogs, participate to conferences. We can run for office. A lot of things that we can do. But I agree with this question that the exact content of those duties might be different depending on your position. If you are CEO of a big industry, you might have more responsibility here to act than if you're just a normal citizen. If you're an artist, maybe the way you should act is try to change representations and value through your work. If you're a politician, of course, that's your job to try to find solutions and so on. So I think that the extent of those duties should be should go according to your power, possibly your position, yes, in some way. And so the best, well, I thought I almost answered to what we can do as individuals. And my own position is that I emphasize the political action even more than the individual behavior change. So it's really important to try to gather with people, to write to your representatives, to ask them to do something about climate change and try to build this huge political movement that we desperately need. And what does it mean to change altogether? I just meant that if we put in place political measures such as regulation, I don't know, incentives to adopt a low carbon way of life and so on, this will apply to everybody and not just to a very motivated minority that would change its way of life alone with the rest of society continuing with business as usual. Well, what do you think, David? Do you have other questions?
There are a few more questions. Maybe we'll take one or two more and then we'll continue on in your talk. He said, how does that sound? I'll raise a couple of these other things that are coming up. Where are we? By the way, there's a comment from Elisheva who made the link, which is an interesting link to also viral diseases and greenhouse gas emissions, and that's meat consumption, which reduction of meat consumption, industrial food complex would definitely make a change. So there is that also individual and structural responsibility on both things. I wonder what you think about that. And there is an interesting question also from Dr. Joseph Gottlieb, who comments that the forces that have led to climate change are cumulative and powerful, and intimately connected to massive economic interests coupled with entrenched values, consumerism, individual liberty, like you pointed out. To overcome this requires a civilizational shift. How do you envision this fundamental transformation that we have to accomplish?
Oh.
That's in 2 sentences.
Okay, thanks. So let's start with meat consumption.
Yeah.
And if everybody becomes a veggie, that would be kind of a civilization shift as well, by the way. No, it's true that meat consumption plays a huge role in CO2 emissions, though the meat sector overall emits around 15% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So that's the same as the whole transportation sector. So it's huge. And it's true that especially red meat, it's pretty impacting though. So trying to eat less red meat or becoming a vegetarian, that helps a lot with respect to your own carbon footprint. It's true. Now, this also has a structural, this is also a structural problem, of course. It's at the same time individual cultural, because habits in food habits are very linked to given cultures, and it's hard to change that rapidly. But there's also a link to the food industry system that has a lot of vested interest, and it's very deeply ingrained in the economic system. So that's also part of the change. And when it comes to the civilization shift, yes, I think we could put it that way. I mean, if we have to change our value system, if we have to forego habits that we've had for a very long time, our representation for red meat for a very long time was a sign that you were wealthy enough to afford to eat red meat. So it was a social marker. It's not only because you have to to put energy in your body. So all those representations have to change. And I think that would be kind of, once we've done all that, it would be kind of a different civilization. But still, how to do that, I don't have any magical answer to that. We have to go progressively by implementing wise policies to try to incentivize people to change, but also, that's the second part of the talk, to change our institutions. And I won't have time to talk about that today, but to change the way our economic system works. It's really now based on consumption, competition, profit. And we see that this led to going and to foster solutions that are even cheaper for typically the food industry, which led to agricultural practices that are not sustainable, for example. So it's the whole logic behind the system that has to change, but we can't do that overnight. We'll have to do it progressively, even though time is now running out. For the climate crisis, we have 30 years left, basically.
Well, as people in the Extinction Rebellion movement and the climate strike movement said, well, the gradualist policies haven't worked. So it's kind of optimistic to say that we need to be progressively to change society. But I'm actually interested in that last sentence you had in the last slide, when you say we must act as citizens, because if we have to make a civilizational shift, it has to be, I suppose, a democratic shift, a transformation of how we organize ourselves as citizens. I think the next part of your talk is going to speak to that as well, right? So maybe this is a good opportunity for you to.
Yes, I could. Yeah, I'm talking about political institutions in the last part of the talk. So it's of course connected to the way we act as citizens. Just before I begin, when I say progressive, don't get me wrong. I don't mean that it should be slow, but I mean that I don't think we will. Well, if we implemented kind of lockdowns and stalling of the economy just to stop emitting right now, this would create other problems that wouldn't be very very nice either, of poverty, of I don't know, undernutrition, of a lot of things. And that's why it's hugely important to do it not just overnight, but over the 2 or 3 decades that we have left. It doesn't mean that it must be slow, it must be very rapid, because societal change is slow by nature.
I would just like to mention that we don't actually have 30 years left, because in order to be carbon negative by 2050, we have to start now. It takes the infrastructure and everything that is needed for that is huge. We should have started, like you said, if we started 20 or 30 years ago, it would have been so much easier. Every month we wait, the cost of it is enormous. And I think people find it very difficult to understand the enormity of the problem and having to act right now. I find it encouraging that most of the solutions that we need and the new economic system that you're talking about is much more humane and will give people, in my opinion, much more joy of life than the system that we are trapped in now. So I see that this is the positive part of the thing, but we don't have time to use. You were talking about the irreversibility of the challenge. So we really don't have any time to lose.
You're absolutely right. And when I say 30 years, is that we should reach zero net emissions in 30 years. So we should begin to act now. And we have 30 years to implement this very massive transformation. So, so let's go for some talks about democracy and Swiss democracy in particular, because I'm also here for that. So I said that, well, we should emphasize our role as citizens and political responses to climate change and emphasize the systemic dimension of the problem. But of course, building a strong political movement around a project of ecological transition requires a pretty high level of trust and adequate institutions. So trust in various things, trust in science first, because we need to agree on facts. We could disagree on how to deal with those facts, how to respond, so which policy we should implement to try to solve the problems, but we should agree on a minimal factual basis. And well, that's difficult right now because the trust in science and science institutions is eroding slowly because of climate denial, for example, or because of the fake news, all the fake news problems. But I won't have time to talk about that in any details, but it's of course very important. Second, we have to have trust in collective action. We need to be confident in the fact that we can build a movement and achieve a lot together, provided that people care about politics and are involved in political movement again. And here the risk would be a depoliticization of the people. The fact that people just retrench in their private life and don't care about the political debate, public debate, and public action anymore. But we desperately need to build again this will to participate in those movements. And we also need trust in political institutions, of course. And I'd like to talk more about the institutions here, because it raises an important question about the fitness of current democratic institutions to tackle environmental problems. So applied to political institution, I use the word trust in a very general way. So my aim here is not to comment on whether people should trust any particular government, because this is highly context dependent, but to ask whether current democratic institutions are trustworthy and up to the task of dealing with environmental problems. So in my sense, trust in political institutions relies a lot on whether people think that their interests or the values they hold dear are well taken into account in the political decision-making process. That doesn't mean that the interests are always take precedence, but they should at least have a chance to have their say or of being taken into account. People should have a minimal minimal control on the way decisions are made and on the functioning of institutions. And this, I think, is a prerequisite to build trust. So I'd like to say a few words here about the Swiss political institutions and how they are built, because I think they have interesting channels through which various interests and values can be pushed into the political agenda. So first, Switzerland has a federal political system, much like the United States or Germany or Belgium, but our states are called cantons. And there are also key differences with the United States, for example. So those three points seem pretty relevant to me. The first one is culture of consensus and proportional representation. We have in Switzerland a variety of political parties. There are 5 main parties and a whole host of smaller parties. And the executive branch of the government is composed of 7 so-called federal councillors. So those are kind of 7 ministers, but even higher than ministers. So we don't have a prime minister. We just have those 7 federal councillors, and they are representative of the 5 of the main parties and of the linguistic regions of Switzerland. Because as you might know, we have 4 official languages, that is German, French, Italian, and Romansh, divided in linguistic regions. And okay, so when we elect those federal councillors, they should be representative of those different regions. And they, all 7, make decisions together, and if possible, in a non-contentious way. So they first try to reach a solution and policies that are okay for everybody. That's why I call here of culture of consensus. Of course, it doesn't work all the time, and sometimes they have to vote, and it's a majority rule. But still, we try to reach agreements and solutions that are that take the various interests of the various populations of the country into account. So this federal council doesn't change in one block, but progressively when the councillors choose to retire or when they are not re-elected. They have to run for re-election every 4 years. And they are elected by the Federal Assembly, which is the equivalent of Congress. So this means that we don't have one ruling party that has a majority and then is overthrown by another party 4 or 5 years later. And the upshot of that is that change is often pretty incremental in Switzerland, and it ensures a stability over the long term. But it also means that Swiss politics is pretty slow. So that's the downside. There are rarely giant leaps forward in Switzerland, but incremental changes over the time. But it ensures pretty good stability of the system. The second feature, so the second bullet point here, is direct democracy. So on top of elections, citizens can vote on a series of issues regularly, usually 4 times a year. And in particular, and that's interesting, they can themselves request a popular vote to oppose a new law or to propose constitutional change. And we call that citizens' initiative, when we propose, the citizens themselves propose a change to the constitution. And we can do that by gathering 100 and 1,000 signatures. So that makes people really feel empowered and have some control over the political process. So that's interesting to build trust as well. Not only this citizens' initiative can sometimes bring about change in the constitution, but it can also simply, because it doesn't work every time. So we have a lot of those initiatives, and most of the time they are rejected, but sometimes they are accepted. But even when they are rejected, it creates a political and a public debate about the issue at hand. So that's a very interesting feature as well. And the third bullet point here, federalism and subsidiarity. So given the federal structure of the political system, a fair amount of power is left to the cantons, so our so-called state. such as land use planning, education, health policy usually. So that enables the cantons to adapt the rules and policies to regional specificities. Is it city or countryside? Is it plain or mountains? Is it a German or Latin culture, and so on? Even though it's pretty small, Switzerland is, we have a lot of diversity in Switzerland, so it enables us to adapt the legislation to the specificities of the place and make people feel that their interests are better taken into account. So COVID-19, by the way, is a very interesting test, like a real-life test for this federal structure, because it's not always easy to manage crisis in a federal system, but maybe I leave that for the conversation because I want to say other things. Because thanks to these different features, trust in political institutions is fairly high in Switzerland, but this is not the end of the story because, of course, from an environmental point of view, there are still gaps in the representation of fundamental interests, as in every democratic state so far. As I mentioned in the first part, most of the vulnerable people to climate change are in the least developed countries, future generations, and so on. We could add here the rest of nature, because climate change will impact it as well. And these in particular interests are precisely not represented in democratic institutions. So I'd like to focus on the case for a little while of future generations. There are multiple reasons why the interests of future generations might not be fully considered in the decision-making process. First, we might have short-sighted voters. So for different reasons, usually the reasons given for that is pure preference for the present. So the psychologist and research in psychology shows that we have a natural tendency to favor what happens close to us in time than far from us in time. And this sends us back to the moral problem I was talking about in the first part, because our moral duty doesn't change according to time, but our propension to act upon a problem does. Well, so that's the first problem. Another problem is the fact that most politicians have short political mandates of 4 years. And so they naturally tend to emphasize or to focus on issues that can bring about results within that 4 years and have more chances to be reelected. So I think that direct democracy that as we have in Switzerland can in part address this problem because, I don't know, the whole constituency has kind of a control on what the politicians do during their mandate. The third point are vested interest with short-term goals. And here we're talking about the influence of lobbies, for example, and economic interests. And here I have to say that unfortunately, Switzerland could do better on this front. Lobbies are quite influential in Switzerland, and money still has some influence on policy, on politics, because we don't have really a regulation of the funding of political campaigns, for example. But still, here again, direct democracy might be part of the answer, because I think the citizens have the possibility to counter those vested interests. For example, we will vote soon in a month on one of those citizens' initiative that ask that all the big multinational companies that are based in Switzerland be held accountable for all the environmental and human rights violations they cause abroad. So this is typically a case where direct democracy, if it is accepted, can rein in those vested interests. And the fourth problem is the absence of future generations. Of course, they are not here to speak and to tell us what they would like, and they are not represented in parliaments, for example. So this particular point here is called in political philosophy the boundary problem. Which interest should be represented in the decision-making process? Where should we stop? So there are conflicting interpretations here. One prominent principle, one prominent answer is called the all-affected principle, and it states that all those who are affected by a decision should have a say about this decision, or at least their interests should be taken into account. But there are two interpretations here. The most traditional one, the legal interpretation, says that only those who are legally affected, that is, those who are bound by the decision taken, that is, the current citizens, should be represented. Another interpretation is that the interest of all those who are causally affected should be represented. So in this last case, climate change has very widespread ramifications. So that means that we should take into account the interest of a lot of people, of course. So focusing on the causal interpretation of this all-affected principle would indeed pretty demanding, but ignoring it altogether doesn't seem satisfactorily either. Do we really have the right to make such life-changing decisions on behalf of future generations, like modifying the basic physical characteristics of the planet? I don't think so. So it raises questions of legitimacy. So legitimacy is the right to rule, or as I wrote on my slide here, it's the justified use of political power. So first question, to whom the use of political power should be justified? And this all-affected principle is one of the answer. So I think we cannot just ignore the interest of future generations just because they are not bound by the decisions, the legal decisions we take now. So we have to take them into account in some way. And yeah, so if we want to represent future generations, that's another problem. Real political representation usually implies authorization and accountability. That is, the citizens authorize the representative to speak for them in the parliament when they vote for them, but they hold them accountable. So they control what they decide, what they say, what they vote for in parliament, and then they can choose to re-elect them or not. Of course, this is not possible with future generations. At least authorization is difficult because future generations are not here, I cannot vote. But accountability could be in some way. So more than representing future generations, I would say it's more advocating on behalf of future generation, more than full political representation. So different kinds of institutional reforms have been proposed to bridge this representation gap. Some of them have been tested, including in Israel, not always with a huge success. But in Switzerland, so far, we still lack one of those solutions. So solutions that are proposed to improve representation include special representative for the future, so reserving seats in parliaments for the future generations, creating a second or third chamber, depending on the political system, that is especially in charge of long-term issues in the future, or changing the number of years in the electoral terms, in the hope that politicians will be less focused on the short term. We also have administrative procedures like an ombudsman for future generation, kind of an advocate. So in Israel, I think you had a commissioner, special commissioner for future generations from 2001 to 2006. Maybe David or Leah can talk more about that, but I'm not sure it was a huge success, but you'll tell me. And intergenerational trust funds, that's what we see in Norway, for example, where they put money, put some savings apart that they cannot use for future generations. And we also have in the category of constitutional guarantees, general protections for future generations, or environmental clauses like a right to enjoy a healthy environment in the future, etc., etc. So some of those proposed reforms are easier to implement than others. And the problem here, maybe, I think, is that political processes, as you know, are slow, and tackling climate change is very urgent, as we said. So I think, even though we have to pursue that, and it's very interesting and important, that we can't probably wait until some of these institutional reforms are conducted, even assuming that they work or that there is political will for that. So this brings us back to the notion of trust and ethics. It seems that for the 2 or 3 decades that are left to solve the problem, we'll have to make do with more or less the current political system. So the only way forward in democracies right now is to build, even though we have imperfect institutions, is to build large coalitions and with majorities. I mean, there's no other choice. So to do that, we really need, and I'll come back to the beginning of my talk, we really need to take our moral duties seriously as citizens, and to trust that building a strong political movement is possible if we can get enough people to get involved in politics again. So we regularly hear that there is no politics anymore, that the art of government has become the art of managing and fostering economic growth. But I take the COVID crisis as an example that politics and ethics can take sometimes precedence over the economic rationale when it is deemed necessary. So the interest of framing climate change as a problem, a moral problem and a systemic problem, is that it reminds us that climate change too is one of those issues that requires to go beyond the short economic terms. And that's precisely in order to live up to our own moral principles. So thanks for your attention. I think there are many things to discuss around those democratic institutions issues. So David, I hand over to you.
Thank you, Augustin. That was very, very inspiring and interesting the way you framed this discussion. And there are a couple of interesting comments here from people coming your way. You can probably see it also in the chat box. I don't have to read it all. A comment from Z. Zimmerman, who said that people don't sufficiently understand ethics and trust. And policymakers as well have a disrespect for specialization. So it's not us to say we want ethics and trust, we should educate humans why these are 2 governing principles. I'll vote for that as an educator. And R. Jeremy, at the Heschel Center, suggests also that people believe in progress. Do people still believe in progress? I don't know. We do still, because progress is very embedded in our culture, so that for many people, future generations is not a problem because they'll probably be smarter and richer than us, so we can leave them out of our problems and they'll sort it out. Do you think progress is one of the things that are in our way, or our notions of progress? That was a comment from Jeremy.
Yeah. So yeah, first question first on the fact that ethics and trust are poorly understood, and I think yes, and there's a reason for that, is that morality has become almost an ugly word in the realm of politics and economics, and that's why I think we should frame much more those problems as moral issues, it is what they are, and not only as just economic questions. And that's very important, and it would maybe help people understand more why it is important. And there's really an effort of education and pedagogy to do here to explain why it is basically a moral problem. When it comes to progress, yes, the ideology of progress is very common now, and this is a problem to me only if we talk about blind progress and purely technological progress. But progress can take many different meanings. I mean, first, as I said, I don't think we should, I'm not against technology per se. I'm against the idea that any innovation is always a progress. Some innovations are useful, some are not, some are counterproductive, some we should absolutely foster. I mean, you cannot have one rule fits all here. So we have really to discriminate between what's useful and what goes in the right direction and what doesn't. And we know today that very energy profligate technologies are not good for climate change, that fossil fuel technologies are not good either. And also, I think that, as I said, technology is just one small part of the problem, and that we need to face much bigger changes also in our value system, in our social life, and so on. And that means that in these domains also we can have progress. And I see the fact that sorry?
Why do you think? I mean, I'm curious. Why do you think moral questions aren't in vogue anymore? Why is it so hard to talk about morality today? Once morality was framed, it was a major frame of culture.
Great question. I think that people conflate a little bit what has to do with morality with what has to do with their private, with subjectivity and their private values. People think that morality is what I'm entitled to think on my own as an individual, and nobody has to tell me what I should think or how I should behave. People think that morality is a private matter, but I don't think so. Morality is part of our value system, and a value system is pretty culturally oriented, so it's a collective thing. And the morality is everywhere in our political institutions as well, in our economic system. The fact that our economic system tends to, this becomes a little technical, we have to have a utilitarian foundation. That is, what we value is fulfilling the preferences of individuals. And to do that, we have to give them a lot of different consumption choices. And that's the way they will reach happiness, for example. That's the fundamental hypothesis behind our economic model, but that's an ethical theory, an ethical position that we can discuss. And there are other moral theories and moral systems possible. So I think that morality is also a collective problem and not only individual. And what I wanted to say about progress is that we can also make progress in this field. We've witnessed that in the history of humanity. I think that the emergence of human rights was a huge progress. So we don't live up to this ideal yet, but we can still progress in that way. And tackling climate change would be a huge progress in this domain too. So progress is not only technological, it's not only economic, it might be in other domains too.
I cannot agree more. I think it's so important to redefine progress. I think it's much more important to make progress in these arenas. Actually, people nowadays, especially people that define themselves from the right side of the political map, value freedoms very, very much. Yeah. And actually, the economic system that we are trapped in reduces our freedoms. Because we look at everything, at all the huge wealth that there is, as if everything can be regarded as in terms of economic transactions. And actually most of life and most of the things that we value most are in the commons and are in the households and are in the communities and not in the market. And it's not that we don't need markets, but we should give them the right proper place in the system and actually make progress in the other realms that were very, very much neglected in the last 50 years. I think this is part of the problems. Now we have so much stuff and we have too little of the things that we value most: time with our communities and children, healthy food, the things that really give joy in life, more time for being out in nature. There is no nature to go out to. The destruction, we have to emphasize that
not
the destruction
in Switzerland. Not in Switzerland.
Yeah, that's true. It is very, very much so. In Switzerland, you're doing wonderful work of conserving nature. And we have to remember that conserving nature is the other side of the coin of climate change. Nature actually bails us out of climate change for all these years. Only 50% of our gas emissions stays in the atmosphere because nature takes it back, and we are destroying the things that actually make life possible on this planet Earth. So actually, I think that we can learn a lot from the way the system in Switzerland for conserving nature.
Thanks. Yeah, it's true that in Switzerland we've been pretty successful in managing, nature in our own country, even though there are controversies about that. Also, the way we handle with the local pollution or waste and so on is pretty good. We are not so good when it comes to biodiversity loss, for example, or if we have a look at climate change. The average per capita emissions are of about 5 tons of carbon per person per year, which is pretty good for an advanced economy, indeed. But actually, we have a quite big environmental impact outside of our territory because we are big consumers. So we import a lot. We import a lot of consumption goods, and we could do better on that front. And just a very quick note about individual liberty, because you talked about that, and I think we have 2 minutes left. That's a very important topic because a lot of people see environmental policies as an infringement on their liberty. But I think this is true only for one given definition of liberty, that is the absence of limit. And so, first of all, constraints on our liberty are everywhere in other domains, not only in environmental problems. And there are also other more political definitions of liberty, like the basic liberties in democracies, the right to vote, to the liberty of opinion, of thought, of assembly, and so on. That's here, again, we should emphasize much more. I think, David, that you are on mute.
David, we don't hear you. You're muted.
I'm unmuting. Demuted me, and I think that might be another insight from COVID. We actually can't solve COVID without restraining some liberty. And I want to thank you, Augustin, for bringing us this insightful talk and discussion that really gives us food for thought and to cross-fertilize ideas that we need in this time of crisis. And we need new and fresh ideas and new ways of looking, and as you said, new ways of looking at our value systems. And I hope that this is just a beginning of a conversation. We can keep it up and keep going, because we've really just scratched the surface. As you argued very clearly, climate change is not an issue to be framed just as an economic issue or just as a technological issue of PPMs and NDCs and renewables. It is that, but much more than that. It's a social and moral and democratic challenge for us that we have to rise up to. And first, we have to wake up to. So I want to thank everyone and the Swiss Embassy and the ambassador, to all the teams that have made it possible to start this discussion, and invite us to keep it up. And Augustin, to be in touch with us at the Heschel Center. We're intrigued also what you're doing over there at your Sustainability Center. We'll
yes, sure.
Maybe afterwards. So, toda raba, merci beaucoup.
Oh.
And litot to everyone. Thank you for participating.